Guys, and welcome to the recap of round number 4 in the game between Hikaru Nakamura and Levon Aronian. So before this game, Levon was leading the group with 2 points out of 3 games, and Hikaru was in last place with only 1 point, so it's kind of already a must-win situation for Hikaru, especially given the fact that Levon is one of his main competitors in the Grand Prix. Hikaru has 13 points right now, Levon has 10, so he kind of had to catch up with him in the standings. So Hikaru opened the game up with the move e4, Levon played e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop e5, and knight to f6. So this is known as the Berlin defense. It's also what Levon played yesterday with the black pieces against Andrei Yesipenko. And in that game, just like today's game, Yesipenko played d3, bishop c5, c3. So they're following that game between Yesipenko and Levon yesterday. d5, pawn takes, queen takes, bishop c4, queen to d6, knight bd2, castles, b4, bishop b6. Once again, this has all been played before, so don't want to go into too much depth. Castles, bishop f5, queen c2 to defend the pawn, rook 88. And in this position, Yesipenko played the move knight e4. But after Levon traded and played bishop g4, he had a very comfortable position, and Yesipenko felt that after queen e2, queen g6, which was played in the game, he didn't really see a way forward, and Levon got a big advantage, but the game eventually ended in a draw. But Hikaru had other ideas. He played the move a4. So now the point is, if black takes on d3, you want to take everything, and then at the end of it all, you go a5 and trap this bishop on b6. So black has to address that one way or another, which is why Levon played a5, b5, and knight to e7. So all of this has been played before, I believe, in a match between Fabiano Caruana and Alexander Grishuk in a match in 2017. In one of the games, Caruana played bishop a3, they traded, and it seemed like black was doing fine. In another game, he played queen to b3, but in his last game, he played the move queen to a2. So given the fact that that was sort of the last word in that line, means that queen a2 is probably the critical move, and it's also the move that Hikaru went for in this game. So now taking on d3 is probably not a good idea. We go bishop a3, hit the queen. And if black goes bishop c5 now we take here. And if you recapture, you hang the bishop on c5, so you cannot do that. So you will have to take here, but the computer says that after bishop c2, this bishop is under attack, knight c4 is coming. And white has some sort of initiative here. So instead of all that, Levon played knight to g6, and now Hikaru played bishop a3, hitting the queen, bishop to c5, takes, and now he goes for the move d4. So it's quite interesting, because eventually white will probably get an isolated pawn, but white has some activity, which gives white chances for an advantage. Anyway, Levon played queen to d6, delaying the capture on d4, rook fe1. He now took on d4, pawn takes, and here I believe in the game between Caruana and Grishuk played the move knight to f4, and you want to blockade the d5 square with one of the knights. Maybe bishop e6 is also a move, and it seemed like black was doing fine in that game. But in this game, Levon went for knight to d5. Now, in this position, we were expecting Hikaru to play something like rook ac1, putting the rook on the open file. It's important to point out that black actually has a little threat after knight to d5. Let's say you go h3, there's knight b4, hitting the queen, and if the queen moves, there's knight c2, and all of a sudden black just wins the game because we fork both the rooks. So Hikaru took on d5, takes, and knight c4. So he's hitting the pawn on a5, and it's not that easy to protect the pawn. Because let's say you go b6, white goes knight e3, and you have a fork on the rook and the bishop, and white simply wins the game. So instead of that, Levon went bishop to g4. Now, if you go knight e3 here, now black can take, and if you take, black can recapture, and black is pretty much winning. The knight and the bishop are much stronger than the rook. So instead of that, Hikaru decided to take the pawn on a5, and this is probably the first moment in the game where Levon makes a serious mistake. In this position, he should have taken on f3 and then played the move c6, because you cannot take that pawn because you leave your knight hanging. And you can take over here, but after pawn takes b5, black is probably doing fine. We can go a5, but the knight on b7 is kind of misplaced, and black should be doing fine here. But Levon played the move b6, so he's hitting the knight. Then I went to c6, because it also guards the pawn on d4. Now he took an f3, and he played the move h6. So you make sure that he always has some room for the king. Now Hikaru played rook ac1, a good move. Putting the rook in the open file, very often the rook wants to go here, where it guards this pawn, also this pawn. So Levon played king h7, rook to c4, to guard everything. And now the position was not easy for Levant. I mean, white's up a pawn. If white goes knight e7 and trades off these knights, like the black's queen side can easily start collapsing. So Levant played rook g5 check. He's looking for a counterplay. So Hikaru played king over to f1 and rook h5. And this pawn on h2 is surprisingly difficult to protect. I mean, if you go king g1, then well, black can just repeat, right? So you don't want to do that. So instead of that, Hikaru played the move knight to e7. Levant took the pawn, and here Hikaru played a really good move. So the problem is, if you take on c7, black gives a check, king e2, takes, and after rook e8, you lose the knight. So you don't want to do that. Now, also, you don't want to take on g6, because black recaptures and this rook becomes active, so you also don't want to do that. Now, you also have to take into mind, so rook h1 is a threat, but black also wants to go knight f4 or knight h4. So how do we solve all the problems at once? We go rook e4. Right, we cut off the squares from the knight. Now Levant gave a check, king to g2 and rook to a1. So he's making sure that, okay, if white takes here, at least we can take this pawn over here. And this is probably where Hikaru should have played the move knight f5, but I don't know, it doesn't seem like an easy move to play over the board. We hit this pawn, which is difficult to protect, and white keeps a lot of initiative, but over the board it's not easy to figure out that this is the way to go. So instead of that, Hikaru took on g6, black recaptured, and now rook c7. And this is where probably Levant missed a big chance to maybe try to escape with the move rook to f5. I mean, you stop the move d5, you also have a lot of annoying checks over here, and it seems that black is just doing fine here, believe it or not, even though he's down some pawns. But Levant quickly captured a pawn on a4, and perhaps he overlooked Hikaru's response, which is the move d5. A very nice move. So we hit the rook on a4. Now black does not want to trade, because now we simply get two very strong passers in the center. And here it's not easy what black should do. If you go rook a5 going after this pawn, white pushes forward. You give up this pawn, but this pawn on d7 can simply not be stopped. If black goes rook d5, we go for the move rook c8. Not rook e8, because black has rook takes d7, and all of a sudden it's probably black who's winning. And now if you take this rook, you hang this rook, and same way around. If you take a rook on d7, you hang your rook on e8. But instead of that, you go rook c8, and if black takes, we take the rook on f8, white's up a rook, and the game is simply over. So Levant couldn't do that. So instead of that, he played rook a8, and perhaps I feel like if Hikaru would have played the move d6 here, the game would have probably been over on the spot, because d7 is coming, and black is a tough decision to make. If you go passive, well, then sooner or later you are going to lose this pawn on b6, and with another b pawn over here, white is simply going to push forward. But instead of that, Hikaru played rook e7 right away. So he's hitting the pawn on g7, which would actually lead to checkmate. So Levant played h5, making some room for the king, d6, and now rook to f5. So Hikaru took the pawn on g7, king to h6, rook h7 check, king g5, and the move g7. So rook to c8 is once again a threat, which is why Levant played rook to d5. Now if we go rook c8, that would allow rook takes d7, and black is all of a sudden completely fine. So Hikaru gave a check on f4. And you might be thinking like, okay, isn't he just hanging a pawn? But if you take this pawn, now we go rook c8, and if you take on d7, now there's this check over here. So Levant played king to h4, and perhaps with this move he was also hoping for some stalemates. So Hikaru played rook to g7, rook a4, and now rook c8. So d8 is a threat, black has to go to d4, and now he took on g6, rook takes d7, and rook c1, and white threatens checkmate on h1. So black has to go rook to d1, takes, and here we felt that maybe the move f5 was the cleanest way to win, but what Hikaru did was also perfectly fine. He took on b6, and after king g4, rook to b8. Perhaps Levant should have tried to move h4 here, but he took on f4, and after b6 he went rook d7. A tricky move, because if white goes b7 here, it looks like white is winning, right? Because how are you going to stop rook f8 check, and white makes a new queen? But the problem is that black goes rook f7, and now this rook is stopping this rook from moving, because it would take the pawn, and it's also stopping the check. So instead of that, Hikaru gave a check, king e4, and now rook to f3, after which Levant resigned. You might be thinking like, okay, isn't it early to resign? But the problem is that if you go rook b7, white is going to put his rook behind the passed pawn. This rook can never move for the rest of the game, and then you're simply going to move your king up, take this pawn, and you also have a pass on this side of the board, just to illustrate opponent games are always completely lost. So there's simply nothing black can do. So because of that, after rook to f3, Levon resigned. So Hikaru picks up a big win. Now he's tied for second place in the group. He still has plenty of chances to try and qualify to the candidate tournament. But yeah, with all that being said and done, I hope you all enjoyed the video. Make sure to subscribe. More stuff is coming up. And I look forward to seeing you all in the next one.